This video is dealing with the section of an inspector calls that I refer to here as Gerald's story, beginning basically from when the inspector turns back to Gerald to ask him how he knew Eva Smith / Daisy Renton, up until the point at which Gerald leaves. Now, this is probably one of the longest, I think it probably actually is the longest section of any of them that deals with Eva Smith, as Eva's encounter with her was the most detailed and lasted certainly the longest. So there's a great deal of depth to this, and potentially several ways of responding to and interpreting. You have to remember that this is a play. Therefore, we're not getting inside Gerald's head. We're only hearing what Gerald has to say himself. Now, that doesn't mean we necessarily have to believe him, that he's necessarily telling us the truth. In fact, plays usually reflect that in most people's cases, we tend to tell stories in a way that kind of reflects what we want to have reflected. So here's his recounting of his first meeting with her, this section here. So we're interested here in how this pretty much shows the privilege of the upper classes and those in authority. Okay, so we're going to look at this through a number of details and what they begin to tell us about it. So this is the inspector as he turns back to turn back to Gerald. She stopped being Eva Smith looking for a job and became Daisy Renton with other ideas. Now, obviously we have the need to change name, become somebody different. That helps us, particularly with the sense that Eva represents a large number of people, by the fact that she has different personalities, different names at that point. But it's interesting that she stops even looking for a job at this point. That tells us something a little bit more about how down potentially she was. And what does he mean about with other ideas? Well, obviously, the fact that it goes into prostitution could be a particular idea here. Now, we have stage directions at the side that go with them, and notice that Sheila is frequently at stage described as speaking bitterly to him. Her response throughout this, probably understandably, is, well, go as far as aggressive, but certainly very angry and feeling very betrayed by Eric, and that comes over in the way she says things as well as what she says. Okay, as he begins to tell the story to us, he tells us that he goes to the Palace Bar, which of course gets Sheila using one of her sarcastic responses when he clarifies it's the Palace Music Hall. Well, we didn't think he meant Buckingham Palace, which again gives us a sense of how she's reacting. So he says he happened to look in one night. It's a favourite haunt of women of the town. We've got the euphemism there, women of the town, for prostitution. Now, you might ask yourself, why does he feel the need to tell us that? I suppose it is a part of the story as to why Daisy might have been there. Maybe you want to ask yourself the question, how does he know that? Well, maybe being a bit unfair. People do tend to know a lot about the town they live in. Doesn't mean he has to have been a part of this. But whether we believe that he happened to look in one night, whether we believe that he wasn't there for another purpose, well, that's very much down to our interpretation of him. Now, the reaction to that phrase, women of the town, is also interesting in terms of other characters. First of all, we get Mrs. Burling-Sybil reacting with shock, as she does basically throughout this, the few times that she speaks. Women of the town? She's clearly shocked to hear that women of the town hang out anywhere, or just at the Palace Bar, whichever one it is. I think what's important to us is, first of all, that shows the kind of level of the morality that she is so proud of, that she has, that essentially she's more bothered about whether we have people behaving like this at all, whether we have people around like this at all. But at the same time, it also draws to our mind the fact that she's shocked by this, but hasn't been shocked by anything else that happens to Eva Smith. Shocked by the idea of women of the town, not shocked by somebody drinking disinfectant and killing themselves. It's also worth looking at Burling's response. Yes, you know, as in, yes, we all know that. Again, Arthur's well aware of it. Do we read something into that? He goes on to try and suggest that they need to protect Sheila from knowing about these things, which probably shows a huge lack of understanding of Sheila, because she seems quite comfortably aware of this. But then comes one of our lines that really gives Gerald a personality we find it very hard, shall we say, to sympathise with. So, having just talked about the women of the town that hang out at the Palace Bar, his response is to say, "I hate those hard-eyed, doe-faced women." Now, he's not been asked. He's not been asked to say anything about this at all. He's not, well, what do you think of them? This is an open comment from him to say, effectively, first of all, I hate prostitutes. Which is a pretty shocking and unpleasant thing to say. Or why? And he apparently appears to hate them because they're hard-eyed and doe-faced, which is obviously related to their appearance. And why are they hard-eyed and doe-faced? Because they're poor, because they've had a horrific life, because possibly of people like him. It's a very, very difficult line to take on board if we're looking at Gerald in terms of with any sympathy at all. Particularly when it's related to his comment on seeing Eva, or Daisy to him. I noticed a girl who looked quite different. How was she different? She was pretty. So what attracts him to actually pay attention to Daisy is her appearance again. This is a man who's very, very superficial and possibly a little bit of a woman hater in certain ways here. Yet then this is followed up with this genuine moment of emotion when as you see, his lines break apart, his speech breaks to pieces, he's genuinely distressed to imagine that this person he knew is dead. We've got to take both of those probably around about equally. His pursuit of a girl because she's pretty compared to his hatred of the ugly women who are there, having to be prostitutes, obviously, because of the harness of their life, and his genuine concern and affection for her. Now, Sheila continues to be slightly bitter and sarcastic towards him, but does also show that at this point she's beginning to become essentially the inspector in her own way. And this is the kind of line that essentially the inspector would have come up with. We all knew her, and probably between us we killed her. It's taking on the level of responsibility that's expected. When we go back to Gerald and his story carrying on, she looked young and fresh and charming. Again, the word fresh is an incredibly creepy word, really. I'll leave you to think what he means by calling her fresh. But bearing in mind, this is one of the moments when he says he decides to step in and help her. It seems that he's ready to attack Alderman Megati for his behaviour. And again, we get this reaction from Sybil. Staggered. They've called him Old Joe Megati. She has to put Alderman Megati in because, obviously, her shock is that someone of authority would behave this way. At the same point, Priestley is obviously pointing out to us that other people, apart from Gerald, in authority and in positions of responsibility, take advantage of their situation. So, just in the same way that Gerald is able to step in and help somebody and make his choice of who to help, Alderman Megati is able to exploit his position of authority. But also, Sybil's response is to say, we are learning something tonight. Again, hugely ironic, just like her shock at women of the town rather than what really happened to Eva. Here, what she thinks she's learning is that what Alderman Megati is like, not the lesson she's meant to be learning. Now, this is backed up by a line that seems to be taken out of a lot of modern versions of this play when it's put on stage. But it's really quite important, because it's all very well us saying, oh, look, Alderman Megati pushing her into a corner, being all, disgusting in the way he's behaving. But with Sheila saying, a girl I know had to see him at the town hall one afternoon, only escaped with a torn blouse, actually pushes him as far as a potential rapist. This is a picture of men exploiting women at quite an unpleasant level, especially if it's a girl that Sheila had to know, and Sheila knew. We're not talking about an Eva Smith here. So he then takes her under his wing. Now, again, interesting to think, he hates those hard-eyed, doe-faced women. This one's young and pretty, and so he'll take her on board. Maybe worth thinking, who actually needed saving the most? Well, the pretty girl, according to him. In this section here, when we hear him about what he does to support her and help her, the question we have to be going at is he being protective, as even Sheila seems to admit, or is he actually being exploitative? And the difference may be between Priestley's intentions and our response as a modern audience, which often creates a very big gap with Gerald. So he takes her along to the county hotel, which he knew would be quiet at that time of night. It's a hotel. What happens at hotels? He says he's taking there because it's a place they can talk. Well, when relating to us what she says to him, she's deliberately vague about her past. So again, talking of Eva as a character, she's taking responsibility, should we put it that way. She's not blaming anybody else. She's not there to say, I've been dealt with so badly. Now, when the mistress bit then comes out, we have another of these moments from Sybil, shocked again to hear that there was a sexual encounter going on here. What? Now, of course, what is she shocked by? We'll come back to that with the disgusting affair in a minute, but certainly not the fact that the girl died horribly, nor the idea that there is an extramarital affair going on. Then this part. Lots of people use this part for the word install, which is very interesting here, for him to say, I didn't install her there so that I could make love to her. Makes her sound a bit like an object, like a washing machine or something that he installs. But he does then use the word make love afterwards, which seems to humanise her as well a little bit more. Maybe it's just showing his privilege, that he thinks of that he thinks of his level of control. Again, why is he explaining himself to the inspector like this? Is it because he genuinely feels this way, or because he understands how it could be taken, he's trying to make himself look better? After Sheila, as rightly pointed out, that should be spoken to her, not to the inspector. The inspector forces them to come back to this idea about becoming a mistress. And this is his response: I suppose it was inevitable. Now, I have great problems with this phrase. Thinking what inevitable means, there's a big concern for me here as to the use of it. How on earth is it inevitable that this would happen? He's basically saying nothing could stop it. It was inevitable that they ended up sleeping together. Now, of course it isn't inevitable. We all know that. He just had to choose not to. He has a fiancée, a partner, shall we say, at that point. I don't think they're engaged by this time. So, he has responsibilities, he has connections. Inevitable sounds like the kind of emotive word that actually gives him a little bit more credit than maybe he deserves. And then he follows up by explaining it's inevitable because she was young and pretty and warm-hearted, which is bad enough in itself. But then to follow up by saying it's inevitable because she was grateful. Well, certainly, if not to them, to us as a modern audience, the idea that it is inevitable that two people are not sleeping together because the girl is grateful to the man is intensely exploitative. Burling's been quiet for a while. He tries to join in and protest about the way Sheila's been brought into him. The inspector shows how far he's got in his aggression towards Burling at this point by turning on him sharply and saying, why should you do any protesting? You threw her out in the first place. And as the story continues, Gerald points out that whether he loved her or not, he didn't feel as strongly about her as she felt about him, which does make it feel, to me at least, a little bit more exploitative than it is. So, having considered his behaviour, let's look at the fallout of it afterwards and whether that tells us any more. Now, I would say this is where he begins to show more understanding than would expect. What I mean by the fallout is not in terms of just the story, the end of the story. I mean in terms of how Sheila reacts and what happens afterwards. So, in response to being told that he probably loved it as being like the fairy prince swooping in and help her, he's quite honest in saying, yes, I suppose I was. Nearly any man would have done. And when we get Mrs. Burling again coming in with her response that this was a disgusting affair, and I have to say, it's certainly in our mind as to why she thinks it's disgusting. Is it because it's an affair, or is it because of who it's with and the class issue? He's very quick to respond and say, it wasn't disgusting. Again, to give her credit and to give the situation more credit than he possibly has to. And when she'd been told that she had been happier than she'd ever been before, when he says this, it's almost heartbreaking, really. And you do get the feeling once again that Gerald is genuinely affected and upset by it. Yet, he points out that she still had some money because she had lived very not economically on what I'd allowed her. Still, his language, despite that intensity of feeling, does seem to give him that element of control that I think seems just natural to him in his relationships. But it's also worth noting that she didn't exploit this. She didn't use the money, as many of us probably would have done. Doesn't want to take any more. More evidence of her morality. She didn't want to reveal the details of what happened to her. She doesn't want sympathy here. She doesn't really want to live off charity in any kind of a way either. The inspector adds in the importance of this situation to Eva by saying that in her diary she had suggested she felt there'd never be anything as good again for her. This was the peak of her life, basically, at this point. Which obviously affects Gerald hugely, but again, if we're seeing it as all exploitative, could potentially make Gerald as bad as any of them, if not worse. Now, here's where we really hit the big fallout. Sheila gives him the ring. There are three key moments with the ring, of course. Him presenting it to her in the first place, her handing it back, and then him attempting to give it back to her at the end. Right, when he first gives it to her at the beginning, as I'm sure you'll remember, she accepts it happily, gets very excited about it. It's quite comfortable to say, is it the one that you chose for me, that you wanted me to have? Again, giving him the control, then showing it off to her mother. It's the moment that really, probably more than any other, shows her as kind of shallow, maybe, as the rest of the Burlings at the beginning. Now here, for it then to be handed back to him by her, shows the change in the relationship. That she is now the one making the decisions and taking the control. In the same way that at the end, the uncertainty about whether the ring will be taken back or not, whether it will come back around, suggests that at the end, maybe it's not quite as clear as we'd like it to be who's got the control. Of course, she follows it up with a very reasoned response. I don't dislike you as I did half an hour ago. In some odd way, I rather respect you more than I've ever done before. And she links it very much into the idea of truth and truth-telling. understanding. And then shows an incredible understanding herself, Sheila, by pointing out that the reason that she's given him the ring back isn't so much because he's betrayed her, but because they are different people. That understanding, which is an intensely mature response. And if that's mature, this certainly isn't. Horrific, again, from Arthur. When somebody says, now, I'm not defending him, we all know, if somebody says, I'm not doing this, but, you know full well that means they are. I'm not defending him, but, well, then you're defending him. And that's exactly what he's about to do here, clearly, isn't it? Because what this reveals to us is that, in Arthur's eyes, saving the marriage, and we must assume for the reasons that he picked out before, for money, for business reasons, for his own gain, is more important to him than his daughter's happiness. And I would just point out to you, how would you expect a father of a daughter to react after standing there and hearing this story from her fiancé? Certainly not this way. But Gerald just does show the understanding. First of all, he agrees, he understands what she says about you and I aren't the same people sat down to dinner here. And then when Mrs. Burling again stands in with her morality, I think we've just about come to an end of this wretched business. He shows a great deal of understanding on the way out to suggest, I don't think so, I don't think you have, as though he's getting what's going on. Now, what I would argue is that at this point that he exits, Gerald is as close as he ever gets, in fact very, very close indeed, to the position that Sheila and later on Eric are in. He understands what he's done. He understands the impact. He's genuinely upset and hurt by it. He knows what's happening with the inspector. And he gets what Sheila's doing, how Sheila feels. We could certainly have respect for him here. That's, I suppose, if we've forgotten that he potentially exploited the girl and called the other prostitutes hard-eyed, dough-faced women that he hates. But the point really is, if he leaves feeling that way at that point, when he comes back in, he's gone completely the other way. And I think this brings us to a possible interpretation of Gerald and his role in the play. That actually, in the end, he's the one who matters. When men are going to be taught this in fire, blood and anguish, which of course, as we know, they already have been by the time the play is performed twice, so we know they didn't take on the changes. I think there's a great argument that it's nothing. Well, it's not nothing to do with the Burlings, Mr. and Mrs. Burling, and their generation, but they couldn't do it alone. The reason that the Sheila and Eric's and their attitude didn't have any impact at all is because Gerald, closer to their generation than certainly to the older one, sides with the idea of no change when he realises he can get away with things. And that comes back to the idea that basically the establishment, even when they have an understanding of what's going on, will do anything to avoid change. Okay, in the next section, it's Sybil's turn. There's not the complexity in there, of course. The key with her is her very dodgy relationship with the truth, and actually with everybody else.